Tribe of Names, Simon here, and welcome to Monday Muse. Well, it's a very wintry day here in Philadelphia. I'm out walking my hound. Here's Dora. Say hello, Dora. That's Dora. And today we're asking the question, what do you do when you get writer's block? Actually, let me answer that question when we get back to the house. It's freezing and raining out here. Horrible. Oh man, it is bloody freezing out there. Oh, you'd think an Englishman would be used to this kind of weather, wouldn't you? But no, apparently every winter it sneaks up on me and I can't stand it. Anyway, I digress. Welcome to Monday Muse, and this is me really basically talking to the camera, kind of, I don't guess, stream of consciousness kind of thing, where I talk about questions and concepts which often come up when it comes to creative endeavours. And today we're talking about the idea of how do you deal with writer's block. Now, I mean, I suspect if you've been out there and been trying to be creative, you've often encountered, or at least at some point in your career, encountered a moment where you're just not inspired to make any music or indeed any kind of creative endeavour. And trying to get round that has been it's the subject of many books. In fact, I've got a few of them down here which I'll show you in a short while. But essentially, for me, creative blocks tend to sort of stem from other areas of my life which my brain is thinking about, and it's just not letting me be creative. And it took me a while to realise that, certainly for me, that's how writer's block manifests itself. It can be a multitude of other environmental factors as well. It could be the case that you just can't produce music in a crowded environment, maybe not in the right kind of sort of creative space financially or physically or even emotionally, as it often is the case with me. And I'll be honest with you, my biggest bout of writer's block came at around about the start of the 2000s, about 2001, and there was a family tragedy, and after that happened, I could not write for love nor money for about six or 7 months, I think it was, and I genuinely thought that my days as a songwriter were over. So at the time I thought to myself, well, if I can't write music, maybe I could write about music, and I started keeping a journal and trying to look at certain areas of music which I thought might interest me in terms of music criticism and just the idea of writing essays. And while I was doing that, I spent most of my lunchtimes up at this great pub. It's no longer there, unfortunately, in Clapham Common in London, called the Elephant on the Hill, and I would spend most of my lunchtimes up there just writing notes, basically, both to myself and sort of essay notes as well, potential essay notes. And I remember I read 2 books at the time which really reinvigorated my creative drive, and the first one was called The Ambient Century, I think it was called, by a guy called Mark Prendergast, which is literally a book about all of the ambient and esoteric artists between the start of and the end of the 20th century. And that was a great book. And the second one was a book by Brian Eno called A Year with Swollen Appendices, which is pretty much a diary of his life. And I can't remember, it was a diary of 1 year in his life during the 90s, I think it was. And these 2 books gave me possibly the one and only epiphany that I've ever had in my life about music, and that is what's important for me when it comes to music is melody. And I got this basically from reading these books, and that was what I took away with it. And it was the only snap moment in my life, the only sort of epiphany, creative epiphany I've ever really properly had. And once I had that, I was back on the wagon again, making music and churning it out. And I've never really, since that day, looked back since. I've had times when I've been in a creative lull, but never a block, never a thing that I couldn't get round. And I've always been thankful for those 6 months of me going up to this pub at lunchtimes on Clapham Common Hill and reading these books and writing notes, because it gave me a time to sort of step back from making music and really think about why I want to make music and what it is that really excites me about music. But I have had times when I've felt a little bit of a lull in creativity, and to that end, and you often sometimes get this either yourself, you either buy little aids in order to help you sort of like get round those blocks, or people give it to you. They know you're a songwriter, so you might have creative issues, so here's a book on creative blocks and how to get round them. So I have amassed a few books in that respect, and I do use them actually in the creative process. The first one, which for me I think is the one I think was a gift from someone for birthday, which was this thing which is called the writer's block, and it literally is a block, and it's written by a guy called Jason Rekulak, and basically what it is it's little ideas that you can flick open at random to get round a creative issue which is stopping you from proceeding towards your goal. The second one, and I'll be honest with you, I haven't used this as much, is called the Think Pack, and that was I'll bring it up here for you. I think it's Michael Michalko, I think it is. Michael Michalko. I apologise, Michael, if you're watching this and I've really butchered your name. But this is really good as well, and it's a whole load of creative strategies for achieving new and unusual ways of thinking when it comes to creativity. This one, actually, again, a book which has been given to me by a guy called Gary Ewer, and it's called Beating Songwriter's Block. So this really is exactly on the money when it comes to trying to beat the creative writer's block into you if you're actually trying to make music. And finally, this one I have used a lot, and it's fantastic. It's not necessarily a songwriter's aid, but it is a way of, bridging a creative issue, and it's the Book of Answers by Carol Bolt. I think it's actually supposed to be one of those things where you sort of like use it as a little bit like the tarot or something for seeing the future, but it's a decision book where you literally do open it up at random and it will give you a 1-word or a 2-word answer. I don't know if you can see that there. This one says you must, and you can basically ask a question into the air, open this book up and see if you get an answer that actually feels applicable. This one has been probably the one that I've used mostly over the years. When it comes to creative blocks, the first thing I wanted to sort of like make mention of is that a writer's block is not necessarily a failure of creativity or a failure of character. I mean, these just my own opinion here, but I personally think that it's a sign that something else needs to be looked at in your life. Like maybe this part of your subconscious is processing something else and is trying to take priority in a way that you're not consciously recognizing. Some people dread looking at a blank page or starting a project. I'm always a great starter of projects, not so much a great finisher of projects, so that's where your craftsman comes in and your tenacity, where you have to sort of see it through to the end. But there are a couple of ways I've navigated around writer's block when it's temporarily sat itself in my path during sessions. And the first thing is writing on another instrument. And to give you an example of this, I was in a band called Tiny Fish, and it was at the end of the 2000s, the noughties, as we called it back in the UK. It was like 2009, 2010, and I'd spent the previous 15 years working specifically around guitars. First off acoustic guitars and then electric guitars, building songs around guitars. And I think by the end of the 2000s there, I kind of largely mined out that seam of creativity in me. And I was looking for something else to do. So I decided what I'd do is I'd write an album in which none of the stuff that I wrote was on guitar. And that album turned out to be something under a project named Shineback, and an album called Rise Up Forgotten Return Destroyed, in which I'd used exclusively non-guitar means to create the songs. I used keyboards, I'd used sample loops, and that really worked for me. And it's actually been a methodology for me working on subsequent Shineback albums, that I now almost exclusively don't use my guitar for Shineback albums, because it allows me to explore a different creative avenue as a result. The second point I would suggest you try is work with new people. If you've been working with the same old people year in, year out, or you've been working on your own year in, year out, working with new people can jolt you in a different direction, because of course their thinking is not your thinking. And when I say work with new people, you kind of have to be open to their ideas as well. And I've been guilty of that in the past as well, as rigidly holding on to the idea it has to be like this because that's how it is in my head. And the idea of letting it go and letting other people change your songs and making it sound in a way that you would not envisage is not a bad thing. It can be a really good thing, and it's a great way of hopping over any kind of potholes in the road that will that seek to stall your creativity. And the third point that I would give you is, this is going to sound mad, but it does work. And as I said, I was mentioning this earlier on with my earliest writer's block, which is take some time off from music. Take some time away from it. If you've been in the studio, or if you've been writing solidly for 6 months, 9 months, a year, 18 months, even longer, and you're trying to push yourself, you might just not have anything left in the creative jar. You've got to let that jar refill. Just take a little bit of time off. Fix the house up. Go on holiday. Take some time away from music. Or if you can't feel as though you want to take time away from music, maybe practice, maybe sort of scales, or learning some theory about music which you hadn't learned before, or looking into the biographies of bands and trying to imagine sort of like what you would have done in their kind of situation. That's something which I've often put myself in when it comes to third-party writing. When I get a brief that it needs to sound like this, I go check out those musicians or those bands that have been suggested to me and try and imagine myself in their situation. Step back for every now and again, because it does help. And there was another thing I was going to make mention to you. For me personally, I think there's a big difference between writer's block and getting yourself out of a writing rut. Writer's block for me personally means I can't create anything. It is literally nothing inspires me when I pick up a guitar or play on a keyboard or behind a drum kit or anything like that. But getting yourself out of a rut is one of those things which, in my opinion, you kind of tend to notice in retrospect, because I've been in situations where I've written quite happily for 6 months and then look back and realise that all of my songs are sounding very samey. And you can employ these techniques that I have spoken about, the books and all the things like taking time away or writing on another instrument, to get yourself out of that rut. Sometimes, you only have to look at bands like AC/DC, who have written specifically in one style for most of their career. Works fine for them. There's absolutely no reason to change if you're happy. But if you find yourself looking back after 6 months and not being inspired by anything you've written, maybe that's the time to start thinking about branching off in new directions, or trying to surprise yourself and see if you could do something a little bit different. If you have any thoughts about writer's block, how best to get round them, or your experiences of writer's block, by all means please stick them in the comments below, because I would be very interested to read what you have to say about it and your experience of writer's block or being in a creative rut. We've all encountered it. It's not fun, and it can be very demoralising. But as I said, a writer's block is not a failure in creativity or a failure in character. It's merely, for me personally, a sign that something needs to change before you can continue onwards. So I hope this has helped. Until I speak to you next time, Tribe of Names, this is Simon speaking. We'll see you soon. Goodbye.